Listen closely, because what follows isn't the kind of message that lifts you for a moment and disappears by morning. This is the kind that settles quietly beneath everything else and stays there. Most people think avoidant individuals are emotionally distant by nature, cold, detached, almost unreachable, as if they were built without the same capacity for attachment. And if you've ever loved someone like that and felt them pull away, you've probably told yourself that story just to make sense of the confusion. But that explanation is incomplete. Avoidant people don't resist love because they don't feel it. They resist what love does to their sense of control. And that changes everything. They don't lean in more because you love them harder. They shift when the emotional pattern that keeps them feeling in control begins to collapse, not through pressure or conflict, but through the quiet disappearance of the dynamic they've grown used to. At the core isn't lack of feeling, it's regulation of distance. They feel stable when they know the emotional rules. When someone chases, overgives, or waits endlessly, that structure silently forms around them. They don't feel chaos, they feel control. But when that pattern breaks, something shifts internally. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. The emotional environment they were used to regulating is no longer predictable, and for the first time, they are not holding the distance in place. This is where misunderstanding begins. People think withdrawal is punishment. It isn't. It's the system reacting to the removal of what it depended on. Emotional availability that never required effort on their side. Avoidant individuals don't process intimacy as pure safety. It registers as responsibility, expectation, and loss of autonomy. So consistency and reassurance don't always feel like comfort. They can feel like pressure disguised as love. And the more you try to close the gap, the more they retreat. Not because they don't care, but because closeness begins to feel like suffocation. To them, connection is something to manage, not surrender to. But there is a turning point most people miss. When you remain available, regardless of how you are treated, a pattern forms: emotional certainty. And for someone avoidant, certainty removes the tension that keeps attachment awareness alive. That's why intensity doesn't work. It becomes familiar. What disrupts them isn't chaos. It's grounded absence. No anger, no performance, no explanation. Just quiet self-respect. A presence that no longer says, "I'm waiting." And that's where discomfort begins, because suddenly they are no longer controlling the emotional rhythm between you. At first, they may not react, but internally, awareness begins to form. The access they assumed was stable is no longer guaranteed. This is not punishment, it's consequence. And it starts with you stopping the pattern that required you to shrink yourself. When you stop over-explaining, chasing clarity, and offering emotional labor without return, something shifts in you first. You stop performing connection and start living inside it. And that shift is immediately registered. Even if they act unchanged, the dynamic no longer behaves the same. Delays feel different. Your energy is less predictable. Something feels off, even if nothing is said. That uncertainty creates internal friction, because predictability was their safety. Now, unpredictability forces awareness. They don't always express it, but they notice. Something has changed. Why isn't it the same? Why does the space feel different? Why doesn't everything respond like before? These questions don't create emotion instantly. They create awareness. And awareness slowly opens attachment. But most people ruin this moment. The moment they sense distance working, they return to over-giving. They explain, they soften, they restore comfort, and the pattern resets. Because transformation only exists when it is lived, not explained. When you stop proving your value and start living from the assumption that your worth is not negotiable, your behavior changes naturally. You slow down. You become intentional. Your availability is no longer automatic, and that steadiness is unfamiliar, Now the dynamic begins to shift. They are no longer fully in control of the emotional rhythm, and that is what draws them in. Not pursuit, not pressure, but uncertainty around something they assumed was always available. Over time, this creates focus. Not dramatic attraction, but quiet attention. Not because you changed who you are, but because you stopped abandoning yourself to stay close. And in that space, attachment forms differently, through absence, not chase. Avoidant patterns don't always awaken through being pursued. They awaken through realizing something stable is no longer guaranteed. But your clarity matters here. If you rush back into overgiving, the cycle resets. If you try to prove yourself again, the structure stabilizes in their favor. But if you remain steady, calm, present, not overreaching, something new begins to form. They adjust. Small signals appear. Subtle re-engagement. Curiosity instead of certainty. Quiet tests to see if the old dynamic still exists. And this is where everything is decided. Because the shift is not about making someone chase you. It's about no longer abandoning yourself to be chosen. Avoidant individuals don't attach to intensity alone. They respond to emotional steadiness paired with independence, the kind of presence that doesn't collapse under distance. And when they encounter that consistently, something unfamiliar emerges. Respect, then curiosity, then sometimes attachment. Not forced, not immediate, not guaranteed, but real. And while this unfolds externally, something more important is happening internally for you. You are no longer operating from emotional survival, no longer measuring worth through attention, no longer trying to earn stability from inconsistency. That changes everything, because whether they return or not, you are no longer the same person who stayed stuck waiting. You've stepped out of pursuit, resistance, and dependency and into self-direction. And from there, one truth becomes clear. Love was never meant to feel like chasing clarity in silence. It was never meant to require shrinking yourself to be kept. The moment you stop feeding that cycle, the dynamic changes. Not because you controlled it, but because you stopped abandoning yourself inside it. And what remains is truth. Either they meet you in emotional presence, or they reveal they cannot. Either way, you are no longer losing yourself to find out. Because the real shift was never about making them choose you. It was about you no longer needing to be chosen to feel whole. When that absence is experienced without you rushing back in to fill the gap, something deeper begins to form. Something that cannot be manufactured through effort or pressure. It emerges naturally, quietly, in the space where the old pattern used to live. And this is where most people misunderstand what power actually is. Power is not about controlling someone's emotions or steering their behavior. It's not about creating reactions or forcing attachment. Real power is far simpler and far more grounded. It's the state of being so anchored in yourself that someone else's inconsistencies no longer determine your self-worth. When you reach that point, avoidant patterns don't disappear, but they begin to adjust, not because they are being forced to, but because the emotional environment they relied on has changed. There is a shift in gravity. What once felt predictable no longer behaves the same way. And what often gets labeled as emotional dependence is not created through pursuit. It emerges when the old supply system disappears, not because anything was taken from them, but because you stopped unconsciously providing emotional regulation at your own expense. At that stage, emotions they once kept at a distance begin to surface in a different form. Uncertainty, subtle longing, internal questioning, even discomfort around the idea of loss. Not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in fragments, in pauses, in quiet moments they don't fully understand. It isn't submission. It isn't control. It's awareness beginning to form where avoidance once existed. And for the person who has been shrinking themselves just to maintain closeness, this becomes a turning point. Because the moment you stop overextending, explaining, or emotionally carrying the connection alone, the entire structure begins to shift, not only between two people, but within you. Whether they return or not starts to matter less in comparison to what you regain. Your sense of self outside of waiting, and that is where the silence changes meaning. When the cycle of chasing stops, the silence no longer feels like rejection or loss. It becomes something else entirely: clarity. A space where your nervous system is no longer constantly reacting, anticipating, or trying to repair emotional distance. But while that silence feels grounding for you, it feels very different on the other side. For an avoidant individual, silence is not neutral, it is revealing. It removes the background assumption that emotional access will always remain available, regardless of effort. It strips away predictability, and in that absence of predictability, something subtle begins to surface. Not heartbreak in its obvious form, not immediate realization, but a quiet internal disturbance they cannot easily define. A feeling that something familiar is no longer present, yet nothing external clearly explains what has changed. This is because avoidant systems don't register emotional loss instantly. Their nervous response is built to dampen intensity, to delay emotional impact. So instead of immediate grief or clarity, what appears first is confusion, low-level restlessness, fragmented thoughts, moments of recall that don't seem significant on their own, a memory, a tone, a small detail that was previously overlooked. And importantly, this is not happening because you are actively doing something to them. It is happening because you stopped doing something for them. You stopped unconsciously regulating the emotional balance of the connection. And for the first time, they are left with the experience of self-regulation in that space. That is where attachment begins to form, not through pursuit, but through absence of the old structure. Meanwhile, your internal state begins to reorganize. You are no longer operating from the question of whether you will be chosen. You begin operating from a different internal position entirely. How close someone is allowed to come into your life now becomes a conscious or subconscious filter. Your responses naturally change, not as strategy, but as consequence of emotional recalibration. You are no longer over-explaining, over-investing, or decoding silence for meaning. And that shift is immediately noticeable to someone accustomed to emotional predictability. Because in most avoidant dynamics, they are the ones who appear calm, detached, and self-contained. That role feels stable to them. But when they encounter the same emotional steadiness in someone who used to be reactive, something inside them becomes unsettled. Not because they are being pushed away, but because the expected pattern is no longer available. And that is where curiosity begins to replace assumption. Why is there no anxiety? Why is there no pursuit? Why does the dynamic feel different without any explanation? This is the beginning of inward attention. And for someone who has long avoided emotional introspection, that shift is unfamiliar territory. What follows is rarely dramatic. It is subtle, small reappearances, casual messages, slight openings in communication that are quickly covered with distance or humor. Moments that feel almost ordinary on the surface, but carry internal testing underneath them. These are not accidents. They are recalibration attempts. The system is checking whether the old emotional pattern still exists, whether you will step back into the role that maintained the previous balance. And this is the point where everything is decided. Because if you return to over-giving, over-explaining, or emotionally rescuing the connection, the old structure immediately reestablishes itself. But if you remain steady, emotionally present, yet not self-abandoning, something different begins to form. Not pursuit, not withdrawal, but intrigue. They begin to pay attention differently, not because you are doing more, but because you are no longer doing what they depended on. Over time, this creates a shift in internal narrative. They start reinterpreting past interactions. They question assumptions they once held. They reconsider how much stability was actually present in what they previously took for granted. And this is often the part they don't expect. They realize, slowly and indirectly, that emotional safety was never absent. It was simply unnoticed because it was consistent. Now that consistency has changed, it becomes visible in its absence. And paradoxically, the more grounded you become in yourself, the more unsettled the dynamic feels for them. But none of this needs to be announced. It doesn't require explanation. It is communicated entirely through behavior, presence, and emotional self-containment. And that is where the real shift lives, not in control, but in the quiet decision to no longer abandon yourself to maintain someone else's comfort. You remembering who you were before you started abandoning yourself just to keep someone emotionally close? Because that is where everything quietly changes. When you stop chasing certainty from someone who only offers inconsistency, your entire inner world begins to reorganize. At first, it feels unfamiliar. The impulse to reach out still appears. The urge to fix silence still rises. The habit of interpreting distance still tries to take control. But you don't act on it the same way anymore. And that difference is everything. On the surface, nothing dramatic happens. Life continues. Messages come slower. Space increases. Silence becomes more common. But internally, something far more important is taking place. You are no longer outsourcing your emotional stability to someone else's behavior, and that shift cannot be undone once it is truly understood. For the avoidant, this change doesn't feel like loss immediately. It feels like disruption. The familiar emotional rhythm they were used to no longer responds in the same predictable way. The access they assumed was stable begins to feel uncertain. Not because you are doing anything dramatic, but because you are no longer reacting in the way they depended on. And that is where awareness begins to surface. Not in clarity, not in emotional confession, but in fragments. A thought that lingers longer than usual, a memory that returns without warning, a moment of curiosity that doesn't resolve itself immediately. They may find themselves checking your presence, not from obsession, but from uncertainty. Wondering what changed, wondering where your emotional availability went, wondering quietly whether the connection is still the same as before. And that wondering creates internal tension, because when emotional certainty disappears, the system that relied on it begins to adjust. But this is not manipulation. It is not strategy. It is not control. It is what naturally happens when you stop over-functioning emotionally in a dynamic that was built on imbalance. When you stop regulating someone else's comfort at the expense of your own. And in that space, something more grounded begins to form. You are no longer living from pursuit. You are no longer trying to earn presence, attention, or reassurance. You begin to operate from self-respect instead of emotional reaction. And that changes how you show up in every interaction. You respond, but you don't overextend. You care, but you don't collapse into it. You remain present, but not consumed. And that emotional steadiness is unfamiliar to someone who has been used to predictable pursuit, because now the dynamic no longer bends around their distance. It holds its own shape, and that is where the shift becomes undeniable. Avoidant patterns are not drawn to intensity the way people assume. Intensity often confirms their need to withdraw. What actually disrupts them is consistency without dependence, presence without pursuit, care without collapse. That combination creates something they are not used to experiencing: emotional stability that does not rely on them. And that is both attractive and unsettling, because it reflects back something they rarely confront directly: their own avoidance of emotional responsibility. So instead of immediate understanding, what emerges is curiosity. Subtle testing begins, small messages, casual reappearances, slight emotional openings followed by distance again. Not because they are playing games, but because they are trying to measure safety in a new pattern they don't fully understand yet. They are asking, without saying it directly, is it still the same dynamic? Or has something changed for real? And your response, or your lack of old response, becomes the answer. If you return to over-explaining, over-giving, or emotionally over-correcting the distance, the system resets instantly. But if you remain steady, something else begins to form. Not control, not pursuit, but recalibration. They begin to adjust around your emotional consistency instead of your emotional availability. And slowly, attention replaces assumption. Reflection replaces avoidance. Curiosity replaces certainty. And in rare cases, attachment begins to form in a way that doesn't feel forced, but discovered. Because they are no longer interacting with someone who abandons themselves to maintain closeness. They are interacting with someone who remains intact even in distance. And that changes how you are experienced entirely. At the same time, something equally important is unfolding within you. You are no longer in a waiting position. You are no longer measuring your worth through delayed responses or emotional ambiguity. You are no longer negotiating your needs to preserve access. You are simply present in your own life again. And that return to yourself is what makes everything else feel different. Because now, even silence doesn't destabilize you the same way it used to. Even distance doesn't automatically trigger pursuit. Even uncertainty doesn't immediately turn into self-doubt. There is space now where reaction used to be. And in that space, clarity grows, not as emotion, but as understanding. And from that understanding, one truth becomes increasingly clear. Connection is not meant to cost you your self-respect. It is meant to exist alongside it. So whether someone leans in or pulls away no longer defines your emotional center. It only reveals what they are capable of meeting. And that realization is where the real ending begins. Not in someone finally choosing you, but in you no longer abandoning yourself while waiting to be chosen. In the end, everything you've been taken through in this entire understanding leads back to one simple truth that most people only realize after they've exhausted themselves emotionally. You were never meant to lose yourself in order to be loved. You were never meant to over-explain your feelings just to be understood. You were never meant to shrink your needs so someone else could feel comfortable. And you were never meant to keep chasing clarity in a connection that only becomes clear when you step back. What changes everything is not how someone else behaves. It is the moment you stop abandoning yourself in response to their behavior. Because the real shift was never about winning an avoidant, or creating attachment through distance, or learning how to control emotional dynamics. That thinking misses the point entirely. The deeper reality is much more personal and much more powerful. It is about the return to self-respect. When you stop chasing, something unexpected happens. At first, it feels like emptiness, silence, uncertainty, the absence of the familiar emotional rhythm you were used to feeding. But slowly, that emptiness turns into space. And in that space, you begin to hear yourself again. You begin to notice your own thoughts without filtering them through someone else's reaction. You begin to feel your own emotions without immediately trying to fix or suppress them for the sake of connection. You begin to exist without constantly negotiating your worth. And that is where real strength begins. On the other side of that silence, dynamics naturally shift. Not because you forced them, not because you applied pressure, but because you stopped participating in imbalance. People who were used to receiving more than they gave begin to notice the change. Not immediately with clarity, but with discomfort, curiosity, and reflection. But even that is not the center of the story. The center of the story is you. Because whether someone returns or not, whether they realize your value or not, whether they choose closeness or continue distance, you are no longer trapped in the cycle of waiting, hoping, and overextending. You are no longer living as a reaction to someone else's emotional capacity. You are living from your own, and that changes everything. What once felt like power games or emotional pursuit slowly reveals itself to be something far simpler and far more grounded. The difference between self-abandonment and self-honoring. One drains you, the other restores you.